let's move to the tragic events of last week. Of course, I believe it was last Wednesday. There was a stabbing attack at a Manchester synagogue. I suppose what I'm asking is, why do you think we are seeing such a hostile attitude levied towards protests on the issue of Palestine, especially in light of the attack last week?
I think the first thing to say is that the attacks are horrific. Any violence of that sort on anyone, but on innocent civilians, is horrific. And it is certainly not the mandate of any protest that are trying to break the cycle of violence and grounded in non-violence. And I think what we see and what we're seeing right across society is a politics of fear. And I don't question for a minute that there are sections of the Jewish community in Britain who are deeply fearful and witnessing things that make them more fearful, just as it seems obvious that there must be many in the Muslim community seeing Unite the Kingdom marches who must be deeply fearful. There must be many immigrants in this country listening to rhetoric about, mass deportations who must be deeply fearful. And through all that fear, and through politicians, demagogues trading on that fear, because fear is a powerful emotion. Again, we've seen it through history. Then I think it's not surprising that it is used to divide and rule. And I do think that's partly what was happening over the weekend. Different groups in mourning for different reasons, but related reasons, all grounded in, a destabilizing time, being pitted against each other, as if horror at the slaughter in Gaza is incompatible with horror at the slaughter in Manchester, as opposed to stemming from a shared concern for the, sacredness of life, of human life. It's just completely wrong to pit them against each other, but not surprising. But I think it is, amidst all that fear, it's good to be analytical. And it's good to just put under a bit of scrutiny some of the arguments that were advanced for postponing the Saturday protest. There were two primary arguments being advanced by the Met and then by Starmer. And the first was that what you are doing, defend our juries. I'm going to talk specifically about defend our juries, although I'm not, in organising that at the moment because of my bail conditions. So I'm really talking as an observer here.
And we'll get into that later.
We'll come to that later, yes. But what you are doing is you are distracting police resources away from the Jewish community at a time of real threat to life. And real terrorism. And I think that's quite an interesting argument, but let's just come back to that in a second. And the second line of argument, and you saw Rowley sort of articulate this, was that the protests themselves are somehow, or possibly, maybe, inherently anti-Semitic, and themselves, generating violence against the Jewish population, or capable of doing that, and sparking animosity against the Jewish population. So those are the two arguments that were advanced. And I think if there'd been any substance to either of them, then people would have thought seriously about postponing the protest. But there is no substance to either of those arguments. And the first one is interesting, isn't it, in a way, because, they're sort of leaning into our position. They're leaning into our position of saying, you are taking resources away from real terrorism. You're diverting counter-terrorism officers from where they need to be. Well, hang on a second. Let's have a think about that. Who's responsible for that? Who made activity that is obviously not terrorist, supposedly terrorist? Who brought in or purported to bring in legislation that means that people holding cardboard signs against the genocide, against the improper extension of terrorism legislation, are being treated as terrorists? And then the idea that the police have no choice, which again was inherent in sort of the Met Commissioner's communications, the fiction of that has been exposed by seeing his colleagues in different bits of the country, from Totnes to Derry, from Kendal to Edinburgh, policing exactly the same protests, the same law, and deciding that no, arrests were not necessary. So it was a political choice for the Met Police to carry on doing what everybody can see is crazy and everybody can see is disproportionate. There is no obligation to arrest in circumstances where, A, the law is completely ambiguous and uncertain, and B, everyone can see there is no threat to the public at all. The second argument, that the protests are anti-Semitic.
Inherently.
Yeah. That to me is how can it be anti-Semitic to protest against genocide?
I do think you'll have bad apples everywhere. And I think that's less indicative of the whole thing and more anomalous in my mind.
People can say you have large crowds building, some may come along from different places, different sources, all kinds of things can be said for sure. But inherently, the protests are deeply peaceful. The organisation encourages everybody who takes part to participate in non-violence training. The purpose of non-violence training being to help people to find a way to navigate the polarisation in society, not to react, not to allow provocation to get to you. But one of the tragic ironies in this whole situation is that the freedoms we're seeking to defend here, in particular, democratic rights under the European Convention of Human Rights, well, they come in the aftermath of the Holocaust. That's when the European Convention on Human Rights is negotiated and agreed. Never again. How do we make sure that demagoguery and the politics of fear never allows us again to get into a situation where we are standing by and watching as a population is being massacred? And so, to my mind, as somebody of Jewish heritage myself, my maternal grandmother was a German Jew who gets out just in time. And we talk a lot about, the role of the bystander. It would be to dishonour all of that history and all of that legacy, which is ultimately, it's a Jewish legacy, to watch what's happening in Gaza and to be silent about it. And that is why we have so many, or one of the reasons we have many, many Jewish groups, many Jewish people involved in these actions. So this anti-Semitism slur is just wrong. But then there's the secondary point about a role of the protests in sparking anger against the Jewish community and others. So that's a slightly more nuanced argument. It's, okay, we accept, your intention is peaceful, but you cannot be so naive as not to see that these protests are going to make other less responsible people angry. Going back to the so-called war on terror and hundreds of thousands of civilians being slaughtered in Iraq, And at the time, I'm working for the government. I'm a government lawyer. And I do remember reading intelligence assessments at the time saying, we're wary that one of the consequences of this is going to be an increase in terrorist activity because images and film of the suffering of Muslim people in Iraq and elsewhere is being circulated, and that is fanning the flames for Islamic extremism. This is all in inverted commas, and it's my summary of what I remember reading, the intelligence assessments being. Now, nobody suggested at the time that what was fanning the flames of, let's call it for the sake of argument, the terrorism that hits the UK and other places in the aftermath of that. I don't remember anybody saying the cause of it was the marches against the wars.
So, I mean, you've given your analysis, which I suppose is one way of answering the next question. So I'll adjust it slightly. In light of that polarization, well, what do you say to the bereaved Jewish British citizen who says to you, I don't think you should be protesting right now? How do you bridge that gap in light of the polarization you speak of?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because this isn't all rational, is it? I mean, I guess the first part of my answer to you was quite a sort of rational analysis of those arguments, and it isn't all rational. When people are grieving, it doesn't feel rational. Be like telling somebody at a funeral, you will get over it, right? It's not the right thing to say, is it? But right now, there are a lot of people feeling grief for a lot of reasons, and a lot of people feeling fear. And I'm going to come directly to your question in a second,
please.
But let's also remember, at an emotional level, I think was it another 60 Palestinians killed in Gaza on Saturday night when, allegedly a ceasefire. Think about the grief about that, the grief of the people who are still starving. There was an arson attack on a mosque in Sussex on Saturday that, barely made any headlines.
Yeah.
By the fear
you're right,
of communities around that. If we get into a place where whenever there is grief, whenever there is fear, at a time where there is so much of both of those things, and that becomes a reason to stop doing the thing that aims to address that polarization, then what we end up in is a lack of agency. We end up with people doing nothing for fear that they're going to offend somebody, and that feeds the conditions of fascism and authoritarianism that is driving all of this. Not saying those would be the words for someone in grief, but I think the words would be, please join us, because we've got to come together. We've got to come together if we're going to address the causes of this polarization. And allowing politicians to play this game of divide and rule and pitting us against each other, all of this as human beings together, not as Jews, not as Palestinians, as human beings. Let's come together against all of this.